Our reading this morning is 2 Samuel chapter 9. David asked, "Is there anyone remaining from the family of Saul I can show kindness to for Jonathan's sake?" There was a servant of Saul's family named Ziba. They summoned him to David, and the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" "I am your servant," he replied. So the king asked, "Is there anyone left of Saul's family that I can show the kindness of God to?" Ziba said to the king, "There is still Jonathan's son, who was injured in both his feet." The king asked him, "Where is he?" Ziba answered the king, "You'll find him in Lodebar, at the house of Machir, son of Ammiel." So King David had him brought from the house of Machir, son of Ammiel, in Lodebar. Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David, fell face down, and paid homage. David said, "Mephibosheth." "I am your servant," he replied. "Don't be afraid," David said to him, "since I intend to show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all your grandfather Saul's fields, and you will always eat meals at my table." Mephibosheth paid homage and said, "What is your servant that you take an interest in a dead dog like me?" Then the king summoned Saul's attendant Ziba and said to him, "I have given to your master's grandson all that belonged to Saul and his family. You, your sons and your servants are to work the ground for him, and you are to bring in the crops so your master's grandson will have food to eat. But Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, is always to eat at my table." Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Ziba said to the king, "Your servant will do all my lord the king commands." So Mephibosheth ate at David's table, just like one of the king's sons. Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah. All those living in Ziba's house were Mephibosheth's servants. However, Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem because he always ate at the king's table. His feet had been injured. This is the word of the Lord.
On October the 10th, 2008, would-be President Barack Obama and Senator John McCain were engaged in a town hall debate when two members of the town hall made comments accusing the would-be president of being an Arab who was consorting with terrorists, and that they were fearful for what a Barack Obama presidency would bring. And in that town hall, John McCain grabbed the microphone from the people who were making those comments, shook his head and said, "No, ma'am. He's a decent family man, citizen that I just happen to have disagreements with on fundamental issues, and that's what this campaign is all about." That comment, that moment became a defining symbol for how people viewed and thought of John McCain for years, particularly at his funeral 10 years later. That came up again, and it was said that John McCain believed that partisans should disagree without demonizing each other. Now, this perspective feels like a universe ago, right? Where we're at in our current political climate, where there seems to be only partisan loyalists or partisan enemies. A disagreement on policy positions today feels like, not just in America, but really across the globe, tantamount to an unforgivable act of tyranny. Now, the talk of politics and government and church makes everybody super anxious. You guys are all anxious. I'm not anxious. People would have advised me for years, "Brad, don't ever reference politics or government and church. It just divides people. There's no win." And that would probably be a bit easier if about 62% of the Bible wasn't involving governments and societal issues and kings and governors and leaders. And the point today isn't really about political policy, but there is something striking that happens in the life of David. In the previous weeks, we've seen David, as a shepherd. It gets overlooked. We've seen him fight Goliath, and we've seen him, particularly last week, wandering in the wilderness. Phenomenal teaching from Ben Crocker. If you haven't had a chance to go back and to see that, make sure you go back and watch that. Well, today things kind of take a turn in our series, and we see David enter into a season of governance as king, and the first thing he has to do is deal with the previous party, the previous dynasty in his leadership. Up to this point, again, David's been an overlooked shepherd, briefly a war hero, and for now, more than a decade, he's been an enemy of the state. Saul's tenure as king ends unceremoniously and tragically. As Saul arrogantly and without the blessing of God engages war with the Philistines, he's ignored every piece of advice Samuel has given. And if you've happened to have a chance to watch kind of the Amazon Prime kind of creative vision of the life of David called The House of David, I've watched the episode once. The only thing I've seen, I didn't know it was coming out when I was preparing this teaching. A lot of creative license, but kind of the dynamic between Saul and Samuel is portrayed, I think, pretty well of Samuel becomes Saul's enemy because Samuel keeps telling Saul the truth, and Saul doesn't want to hear the truth. Saul wants to hear what he wants to hear. And he ignores all of Samuel's warnings. He thinks that the success he's had militarily has been a result of his skill, and he ignores the fact that it's God who's been winning the battle for him. And he goes to war with the Philistines. The Philistines begin to overwhelm Saul. He is wounded, and he does not want to be captured, and so he takes his own life. In that same battle, Saul's sons are killed, including his son Jonathan, who was David's best friend. That paved the way for David to eventually ascend as king, and in many ancient cultures, and even in some modern cultures today, when a new dynasty begins to rule, the losing dynasty would receive more than a barrage of mean tweets and negative press statements. Everyone from the previous party or the previous family dynasty would be considered an enemy and a threat to the throne, and they would be terminated. That is the expected script when David becomes king. And of all the kings who might have justifiable reason to terminate the previous king's family or servants because they are a threat to the throne, David is a guy who has a pretty good case because the previous administration has spent 10, 11, 12 years ruining David's life. David has been in exile. David has been on the run. It has cost David's family. It's ruined his relationships. It cost him ultimately his best friend. In addition to just the wear and tear in his own soul, being essentially excommunicated from his homeland and forced to live as a refugee in war territory. Yet, David made a covenant promise with Saul's son Jonathan back in the wilderness. They made an oath to each other that they would look out for each other's family, with the emphasis coming from Jonathan to David. Jonathan could read the tea leaves. Jonathan knew who his father was, even though he tried to be loyal to him. Jonathan also could see that God's hand was on David. Jonathan recognized the blessing of David's anointing. Matter of fact, there's this moment where Jonathan takes off his royal robe and takes off his sword, and he gives it to David. And what Jonathan was doing was saying, I recognize you're the one who's going to wear this royal robe. You're the one who's going to be the commander of the king's army. I understand how this is going to play out, and I'm okay with it. David, would you do me this one great favor? Would you be kind to my family? And David says, I will always be kind to your family. And so David becomes king, and he asks, is there anyone from Saul or Jonathan's family that I can show kindness to for Jonathan's sake? And the answer was yes. Jonathan had a young son named Mephibosheth, whose early life had been a series of unfortunate tragedies. Consider this. When he was 5 years old, that's when Saul was at war, where he eventually took his own life, and his son Jonathan died. Well, in the heat of battle, the nurse who was caring for Mephibosheth wanted to get him away from war, wanted to get him away from bloodshed, takes him and runs, and the nurse trips, lands on Mephibosheth's legs and feet, and cripples the boy. Now, if you think the name Mephibosheth is peculiar, wait till you hear its Hebrew meaning. Mephibosheth literally means dispenser of shame. And in a Hebrew culture, like, your name meant a lot. And so whether or not this was his birth name would have been a really, it would make us curious about the origins of his birth. Or if Mephibosheth decided to adopt this name later in life because he felt like this described his story. Either way, it certainly shows how other people saw Mephibosheth and how Mephibosheth sees himself. Because when Ziba goes to get Mephibosheth and bring him to the king, he's terrified. Of course he's terrified. His assumption has to be, they found me. I'm coming. I'm being summoned to Jerusalem. I'm going to be, at best case scenario, locked away in chains. Worst case scenario. And so he's super anxious. He comes and he meets the king. And David clearly recognizes the anxiety that's going on in Mephibosheth. And he says to Mephibosheth, don't be afraid. I intend to show you kindness for the sake of your father, Jonathan. Now, keep in mind, this close friendship with Jonathan would have been when Mephibosheth was 5 years old. He would have had no kind of early childhood memories of their relationship. Maybe he heard some stories that he probably thought were over-exaggerated. And Mephibosheth's response to David saying, don't be afraid, I'm here to show you kindness, is very telling. Here is how Mephibosheth responded. What is your servant, what am I, that you take an interest in a dead dog like me? Mephibosheth's default response was to insult himself in a way that was about as culturally degrading as you could be at that moment. Now, we love our puppies. I bet half of the room, their puppies sleep in the bed with them. That would have not been the case in ancient times. Dogs were seen as offensive, low-value creatures. Matter of fact, if you remember the story arc of David, this idea of dog, this kind of slang, this negative comment has come up before. Remember when David is facing Goliath? And Goliath is like, he's just taunting Israel. Where's your champion? And all of a sudden, this little scrawny, wimpy kid comes out with some shepherd toys. And Goliath is offended. Like, are you literally sending out this kid? Like, am I a dog? Goliath says. Mephibosheth's view of himself is incredibly low. He lacks any sense of value, and he has no doubt heard stories, words, and lived in environments that supported his belief that he had very little, if any, worth. Maybe today you can relate to Mephibosheth. I want you to consider for just a moment with me the relationship you have with yourself. Now, just hearing those words for some of us probably sounded a bit strange. Brad, like relationship with myself, that's weird. I have a relationship with my family members. I have a relationship with friends and coworkers. I even have a relationship with God. But what do you mean relationship with yourself? Well, have you thought about, particularly lately, how you interact with yourself? The relationship, I contend today, that you invest the most in is the relationship you have with yourself. You have more arguments, you have more conversations, you have more debates with yourself than you have with anyone else. I bet we rarely consider how we dialogue with ourselves. For example, we say things to ourselves that we would never say to our worst enemies. How many of you have chided yourselves even maybe this past week and said to yourself, you're such a loser, you idiot. What kind of moron would do or say that? And that, frankly, is the PG-13 version of what many of us say to ourselves about ourselves. If we heard someone say to a friend or, frankly, a stranger, some of the things that we say to ourselves, we would be like beholden to interject and say, hold on, that's inappropriate. You can't talk to another person that way. We would say to people, hey, those kinds of words leave a mark. Those kinds of words don't just go away. And yet we freely talk to ourselves in ways we would never talk to our worst enemy. Matter of fact, the expression, we are our own worst enemies, is often true in the sense that we can be terribly unkind to ourselves. We see an example of this early on in Jesus' ministry. Jesus is selecting his first group of disciples, and you may know this, Jesus does not pick the people that society would have assumed you would pick to be his first disciples. He picks a bit of a ragtag group, including kind of some rough-necked fishermen. The one we're most familiar with is Peter. And Peter and his fishing colleagues, James, John, and so forth, they were fishing one night, and it was common for them to fish in the evening because when the sun would go down, the surface of the water would cool, the fish would come to the top, and that's when you would use your fishing nets and catch fish. And this particular night, in Luke chapter 5, it's recorded that they didn't catch a thing. It's going to be a really bad day in the market. They spent all night, caught nothing, and here comes this rabbi that's kind of new on the scene. There's a little buzz. He's already engaged them, Andrew, Peter, and so forth. And this rabbi named Jesus is the son of a carpenter. And the rabbi, who's the son of a carpenter, says to a group of professional fishermen, hey, if you'll just put your nets down on the other side of the boat, you'll catch fish. And in what I have to think is a very reluctant but respectful, since you're a rabbi sort of way, Peter responds, we know him as Simon here in Luke, we've worked hard not all night long and caught nothing, but if you say so, I'll let the nets down. The way I imagine this is the fishermen, they kind of like are rolling their eyes, they're doing that look like, this is Joseph's son, and we know he's a great teacher, but like we're generational fishermen. Our boat is about 8 feet wide. We're not catching more fish by just switching sides of the boat. So they reluctantly push off, and you know what happens. Like fish start jumping into their nets. The nets are about to break. They call their buddies over. We need more boats. We need more nets. And those boats come over. And all of a sudden, the boats are about to sink. And listen, this is happening relatively close to the shore because that's where Jesus' words came from. The other fishermen would have been cleaning their nets. Their day to go to the market would have been over. Lots of people would have seen this. This is turning into be a pretty good day. Like Peter and his boys were going to go to the market, and it was going to be a really bad day. They probably weren't going to eat that night. And all of a sudden, not only they're going to the market with a lot of fish to sell, they're going with some pretty sensational stories. Like the buzz in the fish market is going to be, hey, Peter, James, John, this is the greatest fish catch we've ever seen in this particular market, right? Well, it's also telling how Peter responds to Jesus' kindness in that moment. When Peter saw this grace kindness, he fell at Jesus' knees and he said, go away from me because I am a sinful man, Lord. Peter, like Mephibosheth, is so terribly uncomfortable with the kindness of his benevolent master. You see, the brokenness we experience due to our forefathers' sin and our own sin not only distorts how we think about God, but our broken, fallen nature has distorted how we think about how God thinks about us. I recently heard a very famous and respected teacher reference Peter's response to Jesus in this moment, and he made the claim that this was the only right response to being in the presence of a holy God. And listen, for many years, I would have believed this to be true, but I want us to be just a bit curious today. I wonder if this is actually the result of flawed theology about who God is. Because when Mephibosheth is anxious and self-loathing, David responds to him by saying, don't be afraid. I'm going to show you kindness. When Peter is ashamed and self-loathing, Jesus responds to him by saying, don't be afraid. I've got something better planned for you. Now, David goes on to say to Mephibosheth, I intend to show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I'm going to restore to you all of your grandfather Saul's fields, and you will always eat meals at my table. 3 specific declarations he makes to him. David extends to him mercy and kindness, literally mercy and favor because of who Jonathan was. David makes him rich. Now look, Saul's estate would have been massive. It would have been valuable. He's going to get the estate, he's going to get the possessions, and he's going to get the employees, the servants. David makes him family. His invitation to sit at the king's table was tantamount to adoption. Jesus declares to Peter, from now on, you're going to be catching people. This was another sort of adoption. Peter was a fisherman in his ancestors' business, and this wasn't abnormal, but it also wasn't necessarily a chosen path. When Peter was a young lad, he would have went to the temple. If he would have shown promise as a prospective rabbi, a seasoned rabbi would have put him in a rabbi training program, invited him to be a part of kind of that process, and eventually Peter could have apprenticed under a rabbi and become a rabbi or a teacher himself. But if you didn't show that kind of promise, you would go back home and you would, in most cases, enter into whatever your family's business or trade was. And so, no doubt, Peter went to temple as a young child and was seen as not really having the promise of being one to be apprenticed under a rabbi. He goes back and he's a fisherman. Then all of a sudden, here he is being invited to apprentice under the rabbi who happened to also be the Son of God, the Messiah. Jesus extends mercy and kindness to Peter. He makes Peter rich in the kingdom. He makes Peter a part of the family of God. Hear me this morning. I want to acknowledge there may be a few exceptions in the room, but I think on the whole, for those gathered here this morning, the gospel many of us struggle to believe is not the gospel of the resurrection. You doubt, I doubt, but our biggest doubts are probably not related to the miracles of Jesus. You might struggle with your faith, but I'm here to say I think most of us' biggest struggle is not the historicity and the reliability of Scripture. That's not our great hurdle. I contend today that the gospel we have a hard time believing is the gospel story that says we've been invited to the king's table. The gospel we have a hard time accepting is that Jesus' disposition to us is one of grace and not condemnation. Because, here's what we know. Enemies don't get invited to the king's table. And ordinary roughneck fishermen don't get invited to follow master rabbis. And this begs a question, why? Why is this our default setting? I don't know about you, but I really relate to Mephibosheth. I really relate to Peter and how they understood themselves, the way they responded to the grace and kindness and benevolence of both, in Mephibosheth's case, David, and in Peter's case, Jesus. But I wonder today, can we just be a bit curious, why do we relate so well to them? I think this story tells us something about us as well. You see, when David expresses his desire to be kind to Mephibosheth, to invite him to his table, what does he attribute his motivation to? Jonathan. David said to him, I intend to show you kindness for the sake of your father. Now get this. Mephibosheth identified his worth with his circumstances, his position, his history, and his efficacy. That is, his ability to produce something of value. But David valued Mephibosheth for who his father was. Peter identified his worth with his circumstances, his position, his history, his efficacy. But Jesus identified his worth and value in light of the Father's love. I think many of us in the room today identify our worth by our circumstances, our position, our stories, and our ability to produce something that we deem valuable. We relate our worthiness of God's love to our ability to measure up to some self-created standards. And even when we intellectually know better, maybe because we've been taught otherwise, our hearts say this to God: what is your servant that you would take an interest in a dead dog like me? Anyone? Even though we've heard differently, our default reaction to God's grace and mercy is often, go away from me. I'm a sinful man or woman, Lord. Anyone? What do you suppose God's response then is to our heart's language to him? What'd you say, Drew? Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid of my love. Don't be afraid of what I'm doing in your life. Don't be anxious of my presence. Don't worry. You have been invited to the king's table on account of my Father. I want us to reflect a little bit today on this. I want this story and the messaging of this story to sit on our hearts for a bit. And I'm going to invite our worship team to come back and play for us a little bit. And then we're going to close out in a song of worship. I wonder how we ought to respond today to the knowledge that what makes us worthy in God's sight, what makes us welcome in God's sight, is not our efficacy, our ability to produce something of value. It's not our status, our position, our history, our story, or even our circumstances. It's not your spiritual resume. It's not anything that you have done that earns you or spurns you, but rather who God understands you to be in light of who he is, his Hesed covenant love. Back in the case of David and Mephibosheth, it was a promise made between David and Jonathan. I will show you Hesed covenant, loyal, faithful love. Certainly in the New Testament, when Jesus said to his disciples, I am going to show you a kind of love, a kind of friendship that is unusual, in that I am going to lay my life down for you. Now, maybe you've read about this, but there's a lot of books and philosophy written today about how over the last 50 or 60 years, how we relate to one another has shifted. That in an ancient culture, relationships were much less transactional, much less retail-oriented. And up until 50 or 60 years ago, there was a pretty significant divide between how we related in our business dealings versus how we related in our interpersonal dealings. You see, in a transactional relationship, a retail relationship is this: your cell phone company promises to give you a certain amount of text messages and minutes and data and coverage if you pay them a certain amount of money. And if you find another cell phone company that will do all of that for $12 less a month, you will leave that company and move to this company, right? In all the economic arguments is that's great for the economy. It drives prices lower. It helps the consumer. But here's what sociologists have said is we have more and more over the last 50 or 60 years adopted a transactional business model with our interpersonal relationships. So I'm going to remain friends with you as long as I am able to get something from you. And then if I'm no longer able to get from you what I want or what I used to, or if another friend comes along that offers me some better status or whatever, then I'll just and I can't help but think that if we are framing our relationships interpersonally that way, that we are not also framing our relationship with our God that way. It's a great book I read a couple of years ago. It was called Stop Chasing God. And I read the book with a bit of skepticism. I'm like, no, I've been telling people for 20 years to chase God. And the point of the book was, no, stop chasing God. God's already chased after you. And for an Enneagram 3 type A, super driven, I will show you that I am worthy kind of guy who is having to really work through that. That was just kind of hard for me to accept. But I think that's what this story's about. So how do we respond? I think Mephibosheth shows us how to respond. So many, many years later, after this episode we see in 2 Samuel chapter 9, David's kingdom is unraveling. It's unraveling largely due to some very poor, sinful personal choices David has made. And next week we'll look at some of those blunders, because not all of David's life is awesome. A lot of David's life is really hard. In these blunders, these sinful choices, they cost David dearly. And people are taking advantage now of David's vulnerability. He no longer has the moral edge. He no longer has the confidence of his people. His family is divided. And one such person in the background of the story here with Mephibosheth is involved in taking advantage of David, and it's Ziba. He is the one who initially connected David to Mephibosheth for David to show Mephibosheth this kindness. But then later, when David is vulnerable and all of a sudden his position is shaky, Ziba takes advantage and he tells a gross lie about Mephibosheth. And he convinces David that Mephibosheth has betrayed him, and David is lacking any discernment. He's also not listening to the Spirit, and in a rash moment revokes all of the blessings he gave to Mephibosheth and gives them to Ziba and washes his hands. Word of what has happened gets to Mephibosheth, and he is devastated. His king thinks he's unloyal. His king thinks he's betrayed him. Mephibosheth goes. He is not reluctant now. He goes to meet David. And eventually the truth comes out that Mephibosheth was righteous after all. And David reverses order against Mephibosheth. But get this, Mephibosheth never cared about the land or the possessions. Because he says this to the king: since my lord the king has come back to his palace safely, let Ziba take it all. I don't care about the land. I don't care about the money. I don't care about the possessions. If I can just be right with you, that's all I want. David and Mephibosheth, it's a great story, but it foreshadows a better story and a better David named Jesus, who would invite his enemies to the kingdom table. Instead of offering death, he died so that he could offer life. Instead of punishment, he gives mercy and love. Instead of shame, he offers us riches. Instead of rejection, he gives us a seat at his table, and he calls us sons and daughters. And you see, when you experience this, genuine, steadfast, loyal, covenant mercy and love, when you experience belonging, embrace, when you have been invited to the king's table, the rest just doesn't matter as much. All you need is Jesus. In the words of an old Negro spiritual, no doubt written by a slave, you can have all this world, but give me Jesus. We're going to close our time out. I want to ask you to stand to your feet. We oftentimes have a prayer segment for the teaching. I want to invite us into a moment of prayer now. I want to invite maybe some of our pastors and elders, Neil and Roger and Jackie, if you wouldn't mind, Bill, Mellon, if you wouldn't mind, maybe come down to the front row. I just sense today that there's many who might resonate with Mephibosheth, the dispenser of shame, and you might wonder, why would you show kindness to a dead dog like me? Or maybe you relate to Peter, and your response to the kindness of God is like, I'm unworthy. Maybe you've been in a season where you're just like, do I matter? And you might benefit from prayer today from someone. You might benefit from the embrace of a friend to pray truth over you. And in just a moment, I want to give you freedom to come down front and pray. But I also think today there might be some in the room who have struggled to believe that they are actually welcome at the King's table. And maybe you've grown up around religion, and maybe you've come to church, but you have never trusted in Jesus because primarily of fear. Maybe you're fearful that you're going to have to give up pleasure. Maybe you're fearful that you're going to have to give up control. Maybe you're just fearful that it's not really true. And my prayer would be that the Spirit of God would speak through His Word and through what I have shared today, and you would say, oh, maybe I can let go of some of those fears and I can run to the Father. And maybe you just need somebody to kind of help you walk through that. What would it look like for you to say, I want to, by faith, sit at the King's table. I want to accept the invitation to salvation and rescue from Jesus. I want to be His disciples. I want to be like Peter. I want to come and become fishers of men. We'd love to pray with you in that way. It could be that you've just had a really hard season. And by season, it might not be like 2 or 3 weeks. Maybe it's 2, 3, 4 years. And you just need someone to pray for you. Maybe you just need to find a moment here at this stage that we can make in an altar in prayer. I'm going to pray, and I'm going to invite you to take advantage of spiritual leaders who would love to encourage you and pray for you. I want to invite you to do something that's physical, to go beyond just sitting. Can God hear you in your seat? Absolutely. And if He leads you to do that, just fine. But I just want to encourage you that sometimes taking a step of boldness, if you sense the Spirit prompting you to do that the Lord is drawing you to run to Him, like today, let's do that. Let's pray and be prayed for. Father, would you do a work in our hearts so that we could see your kindness towards us? It doesn't in one slight way diminish your holiness, your grandeur, or your majesty. Actually, it magnifies your holiness. It magnifies your majesty. It magnifies how amazing you are, that you indeed would have a disposition of kindness, mercy, forgiveness, that you pursue us. And for some of my friends who might grip tightly to the chair in front of them today, who aren't totally sure, would you give them faith to believe that they are loved, they are welcomed, they are embraced, that they have a seat at your table? In Jesus' name. If you need prayer, I want to invite you to come right now. And in just a moment, the worship team will lead us to re-sing the good news that we can run to the Father, that He's a good friend, a surgeon for our heart. obey the Spirit.